3 minutes can change everything. A single conversation. A moment of recognition. When boxing legend George Foreman stepped into that rundown gym in Houston, he had no idea his life was about to come full circle in the most unexpected way. The summer heat pressed down on Houston like a weighted blanket. George Foreman wiped his brow as he stepped out of his custom Cadillac Escalade, the Texas sun reflecting off its polished surface. At 72, he still moved with the deliberate confidence of a former heavyweight champion, though time had softened his once intimidating frame. The man who knocked out Joe Frazier to win his first world title, who faced Muhammad Ali in the legendary Rumble in the Jungle, and who shocked the world by reclaiming the heavyweight championship at age 45, now devoted most of his energy to his business empire and charity work. He'd agreed to make this appearance at the East Downtown Community Center as a favor to an old friend, expecting nothing more than the usual handshakes and photos with starstruck fans. The brick building had seen better days. Peeling paint and a faded sign that read, "Third Ward Boxing Academy" greeted him as he pushed through the glass doors. The familiar smell hit him immediately: sweat, leather, and determination, the universal scent of boxing gyms everywhere. Inside, a dozen or so teenagers were scattered across the space, some half-heartedly hitting punching bags, others scrolling through their phones. None of them seemed to notice the legend who had just walked in. "Mr. Foreman," called out Marcus Williams, the gym owner who had invited him. "Thanks for coming down. These kids need some inspiration today." George nodded, scanning the room. His eyes landed on a tall, rail-thin boy in the corner, pounding a heavy bag with such focused fury that he hadn't even registered the celebrity's arrival. Something about the kid's form, the way he pivoted his feet and snapped his jab, struck a chord of familiarity that George couldn't immediately place. "Who's that?" George asked, pointing toward the corner. Marcus lowered his voice. "That's Devin Johnson, our most dedicated fighter, but also our most troubled. His dad was a boxer too, back in the day." The name hit George like a left hook he never saw coming. Johnson. It couldn't be. The room suddenly felt too warm, the air too thin. Memories from 45 years ago flooded back. Another gym, another young man with the same last name, the same fighting style. "His grandfather's name," George said quietly, already knowing the answer. "Was it Ray Johnson?" Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "Yeah, how'd you know? Ray died about 10 years ago. Devin never even met him." George Foreman, two-time heavyweight champion of the world, entrepreneur worth hundreds of millions, suddenly felt like he was back in that Olympic training camp in 1968. Ray Johnson had been his sparring partner, his friend, until that fateful night when everything changed. The night George had made a choice that altered both their destinies forever. "I need to talk to him," George said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Alone." As Marcus called the boy over, George felt an unfamiliar sensation. His hands were trembling. He'd faced Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope strategy in Zaire. He'd survived a near knockout against Ron Lyle in one of boxing's greatest comebacks. He'd built a business empire from scratch after financial ruin. But this conversation with a teenage boy terrified him more than any opponent ever had. Devin approached, suspicion evident in his guarded stance. Tall and lanky like his grandfather, with the same intense eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. The boy wiped sweat from his brow with athletic, tape-wrapped hands. "Devin, this is—" Marcus began. "I know who he is," Devin interrupted, giving George a curt nod. There was no excitement in his voice, no awe at meeting a legend, only a cool detachment that seemed out of place in someone so young. "The grill guy." George almost smiled. In a career spanning Olympic gold, heavyweight titles, and creating one of the most successful kitchen appliances in American history, being reduced to "the grill guy" was both humbling and strangely fitting. "Would you mind showing me what you're working on?" George asked, nodding toward the heavy bag. Devin shrugged. "Sure." He turned back to the bag and unleashed a lightning-fast combination. Jab, cross, hook, his movements fluid and natural. The similarity to Ray's style was undeniable. "You've got your grandfather's left hook," George said quietly. Devin stopped mid-punch and turned. "You knew my grandfather?" And there it was. The moment George had both dreaded and somehow been waiting for since he'd walked into this gym, since perhaps even longer. "Yes," he said simply. "I knew Ray very well." "Is there somewhere we could talk?" The small office at the back of the gym was barely big enough for George's frame, let alone both him and Devin. Faded newspaper clippings covered one wall, local boxers who had made good, though none as successful as the man now sitting awkwardly on a metal folding chair. Through the thin walls came the rhythmic sounds of the gym, the speed bag's distinctive rattle, the heavy thud of gloves against bags, the squeak of shoes on canvas. Devin sat across from George, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. "So you trained with my grandfather?" "That's what my dad said before he took off." George nodded slowly. "We were on the Olympic team together in 1968. I won gold. Ray should have been there too, but what?" Devin pressed when George's voice trailed off. George looked at the boy, looked at him. Beyond the physical resemblance to Ray, he saw something else familiar, that distinctive hunger in his eyes. Not just ambition, but a deeper need to prove himself in a world that had already written him off. It was the same look George had seen in the mirror during his youth in the Fifth Ward, one of Houston's toughest neighborhoods. "Your grandfather was as talented as they come," George continued, "maybe more natural ability than me. But we made different choices. I stayed focused. Ray got distracted." "By what?" "Life," George said simply. "The same things that distract all young men, especially young men from neighborhoods like ours." Devin's expression hardened. "My dad says Grandpa could have been champion if he'd gotten the chances you did, that the system was rigged against him." George felt a flash of the old anger, quickly suppressed. "Is that why your father isn't around? Blaming the system instead of being here for you?" The words hung in the air between them. Devin's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. George sighed. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair." He leaned forward. "Look, your grandfather was my friend. We came up together, two black kids from nothing trying to fight our way out. The night before the Olympic qualifiers, we both went to a party. I left early. Ray stayed." He paused, the memory still vivid after all these years. "There was a fight. Not in the ring. Ray was defending someone, but things got out of hand. He got arrested. By the time everything was sorted out, the qualifiers were over. I went to the Olympics. Ray went back to fighting in small venues for small paydays." Devin's eyes were fixed on George now, his defiance giving way to curiosity. "So what happened between you two? My dad said you guys had a falling out." George stared at the dusty floor tiles. "I didn't visit him when he was locked up. I was focused on my career, on winning gold. I told myself I'd help him when I got back, but—" He shook his head. "Success has a way of making you forget where you came from. By the time I won the heavyweight title in '73, we weren't speaking anymore." "So, my grandfather just gave up?" Devin asked, disappointment evident in his voice. "No," George said firmly. "Ray never gave up. He fought in clubs and small arenas across the country. He was good too, won more than he lost. But without the Olympic platform, without the right connections, boxing can be an unforgiving business." George reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, bringing up an old photo he'd digitized years ago. He handed it to Devin. "This is us. Olympic Training Camp, 1968. Devin studied the image. Two young men, arms around each other's shoulders, both wearing USA boxing gear. His grandfather looked so much like him it was uncanny. "I've never seen a picture of him this young," Devin said quietly. "Ray was the best sparring partner I ever had," George said. "He knew how to push me, make me better. That left hook of his—" He whistled. "It's the same one I saw you throwing just now." Devin handed the phone back, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "So, why are you telling me this now? What do you want?" It was a fair question. George had been asking himself the same thing since he'd recognized Ray's grandson. "I owe your grandfather a debt I can never repay," he said finally. "When I made my comeback in my 40s, when everyone thought I was crazy, I remembered something Ray used to say during those long training sessions. They don't get to tell you when you're finished. That became my mantra when I was fighting guys half my age." George leaned forward. "I should have helped Ray when I had the chance. I can't change that now, but maybe I can help you if you'll let me." Devon's eyes narrowed. "Help me how?" "I don't need your money." "Good," George said with a small smile, "because I wasn't offering money. I'm offering something more valuable. The things I've learned over 50 years in and out of the ring. The knowledge that could save you from making the same mistakes your grandfather and I both made." "What's in it for you?" Devon asked, the skepticism of a kid who'd been let down too many times evident in his voice. "Redemption, maybe," George said honestly. "A chance to pay back an old debt. Or maybe just the opportunity to see what Ray's grandson can do with the right guidance." A heavy silence filled the small office. Through the thin walls they could hear the rhythmic sounds of the gym continuing without them. The speed bag rattling, gloves smacking against leather, the universal soundtrack of dreams in progress. Devon stared at his tape-wrapped hands, then back at the man across from him, a living legend who had somehow known a grandfather he'd never met. "I've got a match next Friday," he said finally. "Golden Gloves qualifier. You could come watch, I guess, if you want." It wasn't much, but it was something. A door cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. George Foreman, who had rebuilt his life multiple times over the decades, recognized the opportunity for what it was. "I'll be there," he said. "Front row." For the first time since they'd met, Devon's expression softened just slightly. He extended his hand, and George shook it, the grip of the young fighter firm against the weathered hand of the champion. As they walked back into the main gym, George watched Devon return to the heavy bag, attacking it with renewed focus. Marcus approached, curiosity evident on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You two were talking for a while." George couldn't take his eyes off the boy, Ray's grandson, carrying a legacy he didn't even fully understand. "That kid has championship potential," he said quietly. "Raw talent like I haven't seen in years." Marcus nodded. "Been telling him that. Nobody believes in him, though, not even himself." "Sometimes," George said, "all it takes is one person who sees what you can become before you see it yourself." He thought of his mentors, of the trainers and fighters who had shaped him, and of Ray Johnson, whose potential had never been fully realized. "I'm coming to his match next Friday, and after that, we'll see." 3 hours later, as the Texas sun began its descent, George sat in his car outside the gym, watching as Devon emerged with a gym bag slung over his shoulder. The boy glanced at the Escalade, hesitated, then gave a small nod before walking toward the bus stop. George Foreman, who had faced the world's most fearsome fighters, who had lost everything and built it all back again, who had gone from the streets of Houston's Fifth Ward to international fame, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of a responsibility that mattered more than titles or wealth. A second chance to right an old wrong, to complete a circle that had begun half a century ago with 2 young boxers and a dream. He started the engine, feeling the familiar determination that had carried him through his most challenging fights. This wouldn't be easy. Changing a young man's life never was. But if there was one thing George Foreman understood better than most, it was that the most meaningful victories often came after the hardest battles. As he drove away, he couldn't help but think that somewhere, Ray Johnson was watching, and maybe, just maybe, preparing to forgive an old friend who had finally stepped back into the ring that mattered most. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone from your past unexpectedly re-entered your life? What would you do if you were given a second chance to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit like if this story resonated with you, And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that might just change your perspective.